What is up, everyone? It's Quinn here, and in today's video, I'm going to be going through my week 2 quarterback start sits. So talking about every single week 2 matchup, all 16 games, talking about every single starting quarterback, and I'm going to be listing them as either a start, fringe option, or a sit. The starts are going to be the quarterbacks you feel very confident throwing into your lineup. These are going to be your mid to high-end QB1s. The fringe options, these are more of like your back-end QB1s, higher end QB2s to maybe mid-tier QB2s just based on the depth of the quarterback position this season. So guys that are definitely still playable, but you're probably not like overly ecstatic to throw them into your lineup here in week 2. If you guys enjoy the video, hit that like button, subscribe. Timestamps are going to be in the description if you want to jump around to your specific players. But let's just dive right into it here. Starting off with the Thursday night game, we have the Bills taking on the Dolphins. And for the Bills here, Josh Allen is matchup proof. You know, he could be going up against the worst defense, the best defense. He's obviously going to be a locked-in start in your lineup. Started off the season great in week 1 fantasy-wise, so I think he is obviously going to be a start this week. Then for the Dolphins, I think Tua is a fringe option. Wouldn't say this is a terrible matchup against the Bills, but I also wouldn't say it's a smash spot here for Tua. He just isn't going to bring you a ton with his legs. So in order for him to have a great fantasy game, he really does just need to dominate through the air, which is definitely possible when you're throwing to Tyreek Hill, Jalen Waddle, but I think he's more in like that fringe QB1 territory, so he is going to be a fringe option for me. Now shifting over to the Sunday slate, we have the Raiders taking on the Ravens. For the Raiders here, I mean, Gardner Minshew, no surprise, he's going to be a sit. Just not a great option week to week, and then also draws a tough matchup here against this Ravens defense. For the Ravens, Lamar Jackson is up there with Josh Allen, where he's matchup proof. We saw him have a solid game in week 1, was really using the legs. I don't think we're going to see him, take that many hits week to week. I think it was like a matchup thing. Obviously a tough defense going up against the Chiefs, but I think Lamar is obviously locked in as a high-end QB1, so fire him up with a lot of confidence. Then we're going to have the Chargers taking on the Panthers. And for the Chargers here, I think it's a solid matchup, better than the Raiders in week 1. The Panthers as a whole just looked completely incompetent week 1. They looked awful on the defensive side. They looked awful on the offensive side. Justin Herbert, I think he played fine from like a real-life perspective in week 1. Obviously, it didn't translate to great fantasy production. He's not going to have the best weapons out there, but I think this is a matchup where he is definitely playable. Probably as like a higher end QB2. And then for the Panthers, I mean, Bryce Young, I had some hope, not necessarily for Bryce Young individually, but just that he'd be able to support the weapons around him. Dave Canales coming in. I'm not throwing that all away, because of one bad week, but it was a really bad week 1. So hopefully we see some improvement, but I mean, you can't even be considering playing Bryce Young at this point with what we've seen here. Looking at the Saints-Cowboys matchup, for the Saints, they went out, absolutely just annihilated the Panthers. Derek Carr played great. I believe he threw for 3 touchdown passes. He is going to be a sit for me this week, though. Coming into the season, I don't think people were overly excited about Derek Carr. I know he had one good game, but now he draws a really, really tough matchup here against the Cowboys, who was coming off a game where they made Deshaun Watson look pretty bad. So Derek Carr is definitely going to be a sit for me. Then for the Cowboys, I have Dak Prescott as a fringe option. I went back and forth between him as a start and a fringe option. The Cowboys are pretty up there in terms of the implied points per game. I do think they're going to score, but Dak is also in that range of quarterback where he's not giving you a ton with his legs. I think also the Jake Ferguson injury, could be a hit to his value. If he plays, he might be limited. Could also just straight up miss this game, which is taking out, Dak's number 2 weapon, or at least limiting him, and like best case or worst case, I guess, would be like his number 3 weapon. So the injury to Ferguson, I think kind of bumps him down to a fringe. If Ferguson's like completely good to go, I could definitely see an argument for him just being a straight up start. Then looking at the Buccaneers taking on the Lions, we have Baker Mayfield coming off of a monster week 1, went out, threw for 4 touchdown passes. I think I have to give him the respect as like a fringe option. He looked great in week 1, throwing to solid weapons, Mike Evans, Chris Godwin. The difference is this is not the Commanders' defense. I don't think the Lions have the most insane secondary, but the Commanders could be dead last in the NFL, at least like bottom 5. So I think it's a much tougher matchup, but I still think he's a fine play as like probably a higher end QB2. And then for Jared Goff here, I think he's a fringe play. Decent matchup here against the Buccaneers. I think Jared Goff is very similar to like a Tua, where The rushing production is pretty much non-existent. He has decent weapons around him, solid weapons, but you just need a really strong passing day to have much of a ceiling. So I still think he's playable, but in terms of someone you're like overly excited to play in your lineup, probably not, which is why I have him here as a fringe play. Moving over to the Colts Packers game here. For the Colts, Anthony Richardson went out, had a really nice fantasy day. I think he only completed like 9 passes, but when you have the rushing upside that he does, obviously it can transfer. He had one of the most insane throws I've ever seen. I think at this point, he's a dude who's going to be pretty matchup proof. The rushing upside, he has the big playability as a passer, so Richardson is going to be a locked-in start. And then looking at the Packers here, unfortunately, we do have that Jordan Love injury. On a positive note, it doesn't look like he's going on IR. It doesn't seem like he's going to be missing an extended period of time, but I'd be pretty shocked if he played here in week 2. So it looks like they're going to go with Malik Willis. He has the weapons around him, but just from what we've seen so far, in the sample size of Malik Willis as like an NFL quarterback, it hasn't been great. I feel like they're just kind of treading water here, so I would just really not be considering playing Malik Willis here going up against the Colts. The next matchup is going to be the Browns taking on the Jaguars, and I'm feeling pretty out on Deshaun Watson. Week 1 was rough. We're in like year 3 of this Cleveland Brown situation. And every year there's some sort of excuse where the first year he was suspended, then you have the injuries, last year injuries, and then he comes out week 1. He just looks bad. It almost looks like he doesn't want to be out there. The accuracy's not there. He's not pushing it down the field. The mobility isn't what it was, in his time with the Texans. So I'm pretty out on Watson. Jaguars defense actually held pretty tough going up against the Dolphins. So I have no interest in playing Deshaun Watson to this point. And I'm just not really holding out hope for like a massive turnaround. For the Jaguars, I like Trevor Lawrence. Low volume passing day in week 1. I think he is someone who can be playable in certain weeks. Just not a great matchup here against the Browns. I think it's a tough draw. If you're super desperate, you need him in there. I don't think he's the worst play, but I would prefer to sit him this week against the Browns. We're going to have the 49ers taking on the Vikings. I think Brock Purdy's a fringe option. Didn't have a great week 1 for fantasy, but that's just kind of how it can go. This team has so many weapons. Certain games are going to dominate on the ground. Other games you're going to have Debo, Ayuk, Kittle, going off in the passing game or the receiving game. Brock Purdy in the passing game. So I think he's a fringe option. That's kind of where he's going to fall in week to week, like back end QB1, higher end QB2. For the Vikings here, I think Sam Darnold looked pretty solid in week 1. In terms of like a fantasy option, really tough matchup here against the 49ers defense. Would definitely prefer to avoid that. But I think most people, when they're looking at Sam Darnold, they're not looking at him to actually play him as a quarterback. They're looking at, can he actually support the weapons around him? I think the answer was yes, which was good enough for me with what we saw in week 1. But for Sam Darnold personally, he is going to be a sit. We're going to have 2 sits in this next matchup. The Seahawks taking on the Patriots. For the Seahawks, I was really interested in seeing what this offense looked like. Wasn't, I guess, a great showing in week 1. Not a ton of passing volume. I wanted to see DK Metcalf, Tyler Lockett, JSN, Noah Fant. There just wasn't a ton to go around. Geno's going to be a sit for me. I think in certain matchups he can be playable. Just not the easiest matchup here against the Patriots. And then for the Patriots, Jacoby Brissett's going to be a sit. I know they kind of got the shocking win. But even in that win, Jacoby Brissett was not really fantasy relevant. So definitely going to be sitting him. Also going to have 2 sits in this next one with the Jets taking on the Titans. For the Jets, I think we should be somewhat encouraged with what we saw out of Aaron Rodgers. I know the game wasn't overly competitive, but it kind of just seemed like one of those things where, a few bad plays kind of compounded on themselves and it just got out of their way. But I think when you compare like Aaron Rodgers game 1, coming off the torn Achilles compared to a dude like Kirk Cousins, I think A-Rod looked pretty decent here. I don't think this is a great matchup here against the Titans. They made Caleb Williams look pretty rough in his NFL debut, so I don't really think it's a smash spot. I think moving forward, Aaron Rodgers would definitely be playable. Week 2, I'd prefer not to, but if you did draft him, to be a depth option, your quarterback 2, or just like a late round quarterback start if you punted the position, I don't think you should feel too bad about what you saw in week 1, even though the fantasy production didn't necessarily deliver. And then for the Titans, this is a really bad matchup against this Jets secondary, and Will Levis looked very rough against the Bears, made some very questionable decisions, so he is definitely going to be a sit for me. Then shifting over to a divisional matchup between the Giants and the Commanders. For the Giants, I mean, Daniel Jones, I just don't think it's happening here. He's going to be a sit. And then for the Commanders, Jaden Daniels, I think, had a really fun week one. He's going to be a start for me. The argument for Jaden Daniels has always been that maybe the situation around him isn't great, but the rushing upside is so elite that it can carry him to elite fantasy production. We've seen it with some of these quarterbacks where they don't need insane passing days to have very high fantasy ceilings. Anthony Richardson, I think, is a prime example of that in week one and just in general this season. Justin Fields in previous seasons, remember, he's not the best passer, doesn't have the best weapons around him, but when he can rip off in a 100-yard rushing game, it straight up does not matter. We saw that with Jaden Daniels. He threw for under 200 yards, 184 passing yards, but he rushed for 88 yards and 2 touchdowns. That is going to give you a very, very high fantasy football ceiling. So I think he can do that here against the Giants. I'm not scared of this defense. He is going to be a start for me. Moving over to the Rams-Cardinals matchup here. For the Rams, I think Stafford is a fringe option. Unfortunate news with him losing Puka Nacua for at least the next 4 weeks. But you still have Cooper Kupp. I'm not scared of this Cardinals defense. I think Stafford's obviously still very talented. So fringe QB1 play. And then for the Cardinals here, I think Kyler Murray's a strong start. Didn't have the most insane week one. I know, Trey McBride, Marvin Harrison Jr. didn't have great games. I've been pretty high on this Cardinals offense heading into the season. I'm not pivoting after one rough week. Also possesses that rushing upside. And I think we did see him use his legs a decent amount in week one, which was encouraging. Now a full season removed from that torn ACL. So he has the rushing upside. He has the weapons. Kyler should be fine moving forward. And I do like him as a start. With this next matchup between the Steelers and the Broncos, I think fantasy-wise, it's pretty interesting for the Steelers here because it looks like he is going to be in line to start week 2. Fields didn't have a great fantasy day in week 1, but the usage was there. He threw for 156 yards, wasn't asked to, have an insane number of pass attempts, but the encouraging sign is the 14 carries for 57 yards. If you're going to give the opportunity to Justin Fields to rush the ball 14 times, he's more often than not going to deliver, way more than 57 yards. They didn't score a touchdown, which obviously is going to affect his fantasy production, but the higher ceiling games are going to come if they let him run it that much. So I like Justin Fields as a start here, not scared of this Broncos defense. And then for the Broncos, Bo Nix did not have the best debut. I think he was someone who's probably not going to be super fantasy relevant in year one in terms of like one quarterback leagues. We'll see how he continues to develop here, but fantasy-wise, going to be a sit for me here, especially against the Steelers, where you have TJ Watt just absolutely dominating. Now, looking at the Bengals-Chiefs matchup, for the Bengals, I have Joe Mixon as a fringe option. You have Jamar Chase with the contract. I guess he was sick heading into week one. If he's willing to play without the contract, then I'm not super worried about him being under the weather. T. Higgins is the concern here, where he misses week one. We've had some weird stuff in previous years where they say he's active, they say he's healthy, and then he just doesn't get, a real workload in the game. So if he's potentially without his number 2 weapon, that's concerning. This is also just a straight up tough Chiefs defense. For Mahomes, he's in that tier of those elite options where regardless of matchup, he's a start in your lineup. I think you have to feel good about his weapons. Rashee Rice, Xavier Worthy, they both kind of balled out in week one. With those weapons, Mahomes could definitely be a very high ceiling option this year for fantasy. Sunday Night Football, we have the Bears taking on the Texans. It was a disappointing week one for Caleb Williams. I don't think you can watch that and feel really any sense of confidence starting him here against the Texans. I'm not giving up on him this year. I'm not giving up on him moving forward. But in terms of him being a week 2 starter, for me, I just would not like that. So he is going to be a sit. I think he'll turn it around, but we got to see it first now at this point. And then for the Texans, CJ Stroud, not a great matchup here against the Bears, but you look at the weapons, you look at him as a talent, he is obviously going to be locked into your fantasy lineup. And then the final game of the week, Monday Night Football, Falcons taking on the Eagles. For the Falcons, this was a tough look for Kirk Cousins. Coming off the torn Achilles, he pretty much had like zero movement. There was pretty much no play action. There was essentially 0 snaps with him actually under center. So not a great look. It seems like he is still very limited, which is not ideal considering like he's back and, we're hearing that he's good to go. So he's definitely going to be a sit for me here. And I think some people with the contract think he's like very locked in. Them drafting Michael Penix with the 8th overall pick or like top 10 is very concerning. And I do think he could get replaced if he continues to struggle. I don't think they made that pick for no reason. I know maybe they wanted, Penix to sit a year or two because they did sign Kirk to that big deal. but if he's not playing well, this is a decent enough roster where they're kind of in a win now situation. So Kirk is going to be a sit for me. And then for the Eagles, I'm going to be starting Jalen Hurts, high-end QB1, regardless of matchup. And for Kirk, I will say, like, I hope he plays well. I hope he turns it around. I like Bijan Robinson. I want Drake London and Kyle Pitts to finally have good quarterback play, but I think there is some real concern here. But that's going to wrap it up for all 16 Week 2 quarterback matchups. If you enjoyed the video, hit that like button, subscribe. Any fantasy questions, drop them down below. But thank you all for stopping by, and I will see you in the next one.